Good evening, everyone, and welcome to, and thank you for joining us for this webinar about ADHD in the menopausal transition. I'm your hostess, or host, I think is more politically correct, Dr. Kelly Teagle. I'm the founder and director of WellFemme, Telehealth Menopause Clinic, and we've got some beautiful guest speakers for you this evening. Before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I live and work, which is the Ngunnawal people, as well as others in the ACT who have connections to the lands. And also a big welcome to all our Indigenous viewers all around the country this evening. Another little thing I'd like to make a point about is that when we're referring to women during our webinar, please do understand that that refers to anyone born with ovaries. So by convention in health, we talk about women's health, but actually we recognise that not everyone who was born with ovaries identifies as being female. So do forgive us for that. So as previously mentioned, we're here to talk about ADHD in the menopausal transition, and it's a very important topic. It was brought about for background because we were noticing at WellFemme that so many more of our patients had been recently diagnosed with ADHD in their perimenopause or menopause, and it seemed to be a very common association. And so having my association with Kirstin, she and I did a little Instagram live on this topic not too long ago that was insanely popular. So we thought maybe we need to take a deeper dive. So I've invited all our beautiful experts along tonight, and I'll introduce them to you now, and then we'll get started. So firstly, Kirstin, wave for us, Kirstin. Kirstin's a clinical and forensic psychologist with nearly 3 decades of experience. She's now postmenopausal herself, but she was far from delighted by her own perimenopausal experience after a late diagnosis of ADHD and burnout to boot. And so being very frustrated by the lack of recognition of the significance of perimenopause and midlife, Kirstin's gone on to launch her All About Her website platform in March of this year. This is a resource hub for Australian women undergoing the menopausal transition, including information, resources, events, courses, and a health practitioner directory. So that's an amazing resource. I highly recommend you check it out, and we'll be circulating the links for these things with your recording link. Now, Dr. David Chapman, who doesn't need to wave because he's the only guy here. He's a consultant psychiatrist in Darwin, formerly in the public system, but now exploring part-time private practice with a dash of academic psychiatry. He has special interests in adult ADHD and women's mental health, and especially the intersection of those things. And through these is involved in the ADHD in females SIG of the Her Centre. Sorry, David?
Special interest.
Of course, I should have recognised that one.
Caroline Gervich.
Right, and that's the Her Centre in Monash, and provides clinical support in a number of research projects of the Turner Institute for Brain and Mental Health. The trial of ADHD, hormones and trauma provides a focus for fascination and ongoing learning and practice development. He's also chair of the Northern Territory Branch Committee of the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists and a member of the Adult Faculty and ADHD Network Committees. He's also a passionate advocate for improved mental health services in the Northern Territory. Well done, David. That's a mouthful. All right, now, welcome to Sherri Murphy as well. Sherri is a registered psychologist committed to helping individuals and couples find solutions to increase well-being, connection, understanding and growth. Her therapeutic approach is client-centred and collaborative, integrating a broad range of treatment modalities to suit the individual needs of each client. Sherri has worked with individuals across the lifespan from diverse cultures and has a background experience in alcohol and other drug settings. She's worked with a range of presentations, including anxiety, mood disorders, ADHD, autism, self-esteem issues, interpersonal and relationship conflicts, trauma, addiction, LGBTQIA+ issues, and grief and loss. And she's going to be telling us all about her exciting new ADHD research project today. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for giving up your time so generously at the end of a long day. We really, really appreciate it. Now, just before we get started, I'm going to pop the presentation up in a moment, but I just wanted to make the point that anything that we tell you tonight is for information only. This does not constitute an individual diagnosis or individualised medical or psychiatric advice whatsoever. You do need to go and get an individualised assessment for that. Okay, now I'll pop the presentation up and then over to you, Kirstin. You're on mute, by the way.
Beautiful. Has that opened up for me? Can you hear me?
It has. I can hear you just fine.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. All right. Well, yeah, thank you everyone for joining us, and for those who watch the recording later who couldn't make it. I get it. Life is busy and it is a difficult time to suit everyone. And particularly thanks, Kelly, for inviting us along. I think all three of us enjoy this conversation quite a lot and could probably talk for a very long time. So it's actually quite fun for us. So yes, let's kind of jump to what we're actually covering today. And it is a fair bit that we want to kind of get through, because I know that myself and Dave and Sherri, we get loads of questions all the time. We're sitting in front of people, women all the time, who have this kind of, I guess, combination of moving through the menopausal years, as well as either having a diagnosis of ADHD or wondering if they should be diagnosed with ADHD. So this is very much our world. So what we're going to talk about today is we're definitely going to obviously kind of just cover some of the stuff that's happening in women's brains at perimenopause. I'm going to have a bit of a chat about why so many midlife women are being diagnosed with ADHD. I'm not sure about all of you listening and tuning in, but I certainly hear, is it just a trend, and some things that really frustrate me, some of those kind of comments. So I want to speak to that. Sherri's going to share her story as well, because it will later provide some context for her research, which she'll talk about. We're going to talk about the symptoms of ADHD compared to perimenopause, because that can be a bit of an overlap, quite a lot of an overlap, and it can be confusing as a result, and how we can tell what's causing what, really. Dave will also talk about the diagnosis and assessment and diagnosis process of ADHD from a psychiatric perspective, and I'll kind of pipe up a little bit about how psychologists sometimes approach these, I guess, an assessment and diagnosis. And we'll be looking at, particularly Dave will be sharing with us medical treatments for ADHD. I really want to talk about neuroaffirming support, neuroaffirming living, which may or may not be a new word for you all. And then we'll also be covering Sherri's research. She's going to talk about that. So that's what we're covering today, a fair bit of stuff. But I guess what I want to really draw attention to is that from puberty to postmenopause, our hormones are a key character in our story. And it's actually something that's, there have been some amazing researchers plugging away at this for decades, Jay Ashry from her centre being just one of them. But it really hasn't been something that's been more broadly recognised or researched. And yet it is a pivotal factor. Our hormones really do impact our general health. They have very gender-specific impacts, sex-specific impacts, and also, you know, in terms of our mental health. So I'm going to hand it over to, let's have a look at what's actually happening to women's brains at perimenopause. And I'm going to kind of bounce back to Dave and Kelly for that part.
Mm-hmm. So I might start off here, David, if that's all right. So when I'm explaining the menopausal transition to women in terms of what's happening hormonally, I find that this is quite a helpful diagram rather than trying to go through all of the specific stages of menopause and perimenopause. What you need to know about the hormones is that before the menopausal transition, you've got these beautiful rhythmic waves and pulses of hormonal changes going on. Like some kind of nice dance, and it's all sort of predictable and you know, it's nice, and I don't know, it's just it's kind of calm for most women. Then what happens in the perimenopausal period is that you start to get these shifts in the the ratio of progesterone to estrogen. You might get some times where you're not ovulating, so you might get long gaps between ovulations, or they're bunched up together. And so what that leads to is this kind of hormonal chaos where everything's out of whack. And then postmenopausally, after you've had your last ovulation, the hormone levels, particularly the estrogen and progesterone, are very, very low or non-existent, but they're very stable. And so what we do tend to find, how this plays out for the woman's experience, is that in perimenopause, we might be getting, to start with, worsening premenstrual mood or migraine. So if you've had PMS or PMDD, that might actually start to cyclically worsen fairly early on, even in perimenopause. And then as you get closer and closer to actual menopause, when you run out of eggs, then your periods might actually start to become erratic, and that might absolutely create a whole lot of hormonal instability and brain chemistry instability, which then can have an impact on your mood, sleep disturbances, flushes, all sorts of things. But then you have your last ovulation, no more periods after that either, and then the hormonal environment actually settles down quite a lot. Now, how that impacts on your brain depends on your own physiology and how, whether your brain is particularly missing the estrogen, but at least you don't get all the ups and downs and the chaos that you can see here in the middle section of the picture. So that's kind of the hormonal things that are going on in the ovaries, at least, that are impacting on the brain, that might lead to all of that stuff going on that's obvious, more obvious, like mood and sleep, but also impacting the brain in terms of things like neurodiversity and how that might be expressed. David, did you want to leap in and explain anything about this particular area?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I don't want to, paint too dark a picture, because we have to remember that menopause is a perfectly normal, natural phase in life. But what's important is that the varying hormone levels have a very, very profound effect on the actual structure of the brain. You're all aware of pregnancy brain. Well, perimenopause and menopause, there are somewhat similar physical changes, and they're very much in the areas that are related to high level thinking and memory. And so it's very common to get sort of brain fog, and I can't remember, why did I come into this room, what am I doing here? And they're to do with the actual physical changes in the brain. They do settle down a bit post-menopausal, but they are enduring changes by and large.
Right, Kirstin, do you want to take us from here?
Clicking the wrong buttons to unmute myself. Okay, but before we kind of go into the ADHD picture and the ADHD and perimenopause, I do think it's really important to have a conversation and share what we know, both from, I guess, research, as well as certainly me sitting in front of lots of women in the therapy room, as well as my colleagues who work in this particular space. You know, we hear time and time again, I guess, particular statements and borne out by the research as to what might explain this apparent increase in diagnoses in ADHD in midlife women. And I guess what we need to start with, and, hang on to your hats, ladies, because, we won't start the conversation about the patriarchy. That will get me too fired up. But essentially, so much of our criteria for mental health kind of conditions, as well as neurodevelopmental conditions as well, and differences, which is what I'd far more like to say, are based on boys. And so it's certainly that common picture of ADHD. The image that we have is boys bouncing off the walls. I remember watching kind of those shows at 6 p.m. or whatever. Tracy Grimshaw's in my head, not that it's a personal thing from her, and she'd be sharing stories, and you'd see these boys absolutely losing it within their homes and within the classroom. And that is the stereotypical kind of picture that we have often had. And even if you dial it back down and it's not quite so extreme, we still have criteria in our diagnosing kind of manual, the DSM it's called, that are largely based on boys. And what we've discovered as time has passed is that it often shows up quite differently in women. Hyperactivity and impulsivity, they can still exist, but they're not necessarily quite so behaviourally obvious for females, basically. So that's one of the first things, is that we're a learning profession, whether it's medicine, psychiatry, psychology. We are continually learning, and unfortunately what we knew back then we now know is a very narrow perspective of what ADHD kind of looks like, and how it's expressed and experienced. The other factor is there's a fair amount of research that shows that females are more likely to be able to, I guess, read the room and adjust their behaviour to fit in. And it's a really important kind of part of being female, is to fit in particular. And as such, we learn to mask. So we hold back, we watch our tongue, we spend a lot of time being hypervigilant in order to be able to present as we believe and are expected to behave. On top of that, we can develop compensatory strategies. And as someone, and I've been very open about this, but as someone who's a late diagnosed ADHD myself, it was quite a huge surprise when I learned that not everyone uses the strategies that I use to proper adult, as I call it. I thought that's how everyone would do it. Or on some things, I just thought, I just wasn't good at it and needed to kind of work twice as hard. So this is a very common phenomenon. It is common in males as well, but I think particularly females are more adept, as I said, reading the room, and more driven to really fit into a narrower band of what's socially acceptable. On top of that, there are a lot of ADHDers who are quite gifted in other areas. And if you're all here, if those of you who are here are in midlife, then you're probably looking at being in your schooling years, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And giftedness had a very, very narrow band in terms of what was just seen as gifted. It was, really kind of straight IQ. We now have a much more expanded perspective of what giftedness is, and it certainly includes creativity, problem solving, intuition, a whole bunch of broader things. And so you may not have been identified back then as gifted, because it was a very narrow definition as well. But essentially, giftedness can help us get through life and be actually relatively successful, however you define that. And that's not something that's spoken about a lot either, but it's often referred to as twice exceptional. So we have, kind of talents and strengths in a couple of areas that offset some of the challenges that we have due to our ADHD. Now, when it comes to also diagnoses of ADHD in midlife women, midlife coincides with this transition, this menopausal transition. And there is reference to what we know as there's a phrase called the estrogen veil. We know that estrogen is neuroprotective, and as it actually kind of declines, we're losing that kind of protective element to some degree. And it brings two things to us to deal with. So in midlife, we've got a lot of demands on us. It's well known that a midlife female is probably at her most busiest, the most responsibilities, the most under stress as she can be at any other time in her life. So the demand is really, really high. And then if you add to that picture the symptoms that can come with the menopausal transition, that also is a demand to be coping with those. At the same time, they also reduce our resources. And so this estrogen veil kind of, as it lifts or as it declines, estrogen declines, it creates this increase in demand and this reduced capacity to cope with it. And that kind of is what can unmask us. That's when our compensatory strategies aren't cutting the mustard, and we're not as able to use them, and we're not perhaps as able to mask even from ourselves. And then the final thing, and this is the really juicy stuff that I'm excited to, when Sherri does her research, she'll talk about it more. But, you know, the menopausal transition is really a psychological developmental stage as well. And so it's a time where we really evaluate lots about ourselves and our relationships and how we live our lives and how we want to live our lives and who we want to be. It's a very natural thing to be self-reflective, although often you have to be out of the trenches of the real tough stuff that comes with a menopausal transition before you can actually sit back and reflect on these things. And so that's happening anyway. And I find, this is just my clinical experience and my personal experience, I find that the women that I've been working with for a long time, and maybe not so long, also describe when they've had a late diagnosis that it's a new way of looking at themselves. So they're prompted to also reevaluate who they are and how they've come to be who they are, just simply because now they've got this new lens that they can look at themselves through. So there's this double whammy in midlife of reflecting and reevaluating self. So I think this is just the whole kind of the planets align, all these things come to play, and that prompts us to be saying, oh, maybe this applies to me. And then we're actually able to access information, learn quite easily about ADHD, and from there, some of us go on to be assessed and diagnosed. So that's my take, as well as the research on why there's this increase. It's not just because it's trendy. But let's head over to Sherri. You've disappeared from my screen, Sherri, but I think maybe it would be a good time for you to share your story.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to have you all here. So, I mean, really, I'm just going to share a little bit of my personal story, just as to what sort of led me to, doing some research, which is I'm really, really excited about. So just, I mean, for me, it was, always she could do better if she applied herself. The feeling lazy, feeling like a reckless, immature little child. So as I got older, I think I really masked that recklessness and the impulsivity and the hyperactivity just by keeping really, really busy and entertaining myself with so many different jobs. I'm always getting teased. I think I've done every single job that could give you an accreditation in one weekend. So then I thought, okay, so how can I calm myself down? So I really got into meditation and mindfulness and all those sorts of things. So that definitely helped. So I just kept busy through that whole period, and then I just really actually wanted to try to apply myself. So I didn't start studying until I was 40, which is, oh my God, pretty old. But then I discovered that lovely little sort of superpower hyper focus, and I was pretty good at studying. So that kept me going for a good 7 years. And then when I hit about 47, I really started finding life harder, and just coming into that perimenopausal area, and I was just starting to feel tired, more burnt out, and all getting the hot flashes or flushes, and insomnia started sort of creeping in, and that brain fog, and then by the time I finished my studies and became a registered psych, I was just before I was 50, and I was crawling to the end. I was so tired. I just wanted to curl up, go to sleep after my sessions. But I was also starting to see lots of people that had ADHD and talking more and more about their experiences. And my daughter was the first one in our family to be diagnosed with ADHD, and she has different things to me, but and so then it was really on my radar once my daughter got diagnosed. And because it was so on my radar, then my husband got diagnosed, and they both did really, really well with medication. And I was just floundering. I went to my GP, who told me to just get through all these symptoms naturally, because that's better for me. So I just felt like my job, my impulsivity was coming back. just over the top. I was really agitated, just so tired. My insomnia was just crazy, up until 5 o'clock in the morning. And then I was getting jealous that my husband and my daughter were doing so well that I thought, and then I just still really just was so, I just really didn't turn that microscope onto myself, even though I was learning so much about ADHD. It was really hard to actually turn the microscope onto myself, and I don't know why that was, but maybe it's easier to see it in other people and not yourself. So that's a problem. And then also, because I'd done meditation and those sorts of things and was doing relatively well, people just didn't think or believe that I had ADHD. So it was only from other psychologists that said, Sherri, I think you should go and, yeah, sounds like me, exactly. I think maybe, yeah, go and get it checked out. And, the day before I had my psychiatrist appointment booked in, I nearly cancelled it. And a colleague of mine said, no, go and do it. So I took my husband, and it was just so obvious that I had ADHD. And actually, I know that some people are saying that they didn't have the symptoms from childhood, but mine was pretty classic from childhood as well. So that just made it easier for me. But I do think to myself, if I was a little more like my daughter, maybe I still would have been minimizing my experience. So, yeah, I mean, for me, I was a little worried about stimulant medication, to be honest, just for my body, because I can't even cope with coffee usually. So just becoming a little bit too good at masking. So, yeah, so that is my story. Yeah. So, but sorry, I'm going to say one more thing. I was getting ready to study again, actually. I was lucky enough to get accepted into the clinical psychology program at Murdoch. And I was so nervous about going back to study the way that I was feeling, just so exhausted, not sleeping. So then I ended up getting the diagnosis, going on the stimulant medication, starting HRT, and oh gosh, it really has changed my life, that's for sure. So then I thought, okay, well, what's going on here? How can other women get help? Why is there hardly any research in this area? And so I've got an opportunity to do postgrad studies. So it's something that I'm really excited to actually, put some research into this area.
Thank you very much for that, Sherri. Thanks for sharing your story so generously. Why don't we roll over to David now to cover this next bit? What the symptoms of ADHD are compared to perimenopause?
Thanks for that, Kelly. The short, simple answer is they look very much alike, and that's part of the problem with diagnosis, that if you don't know you're in perimenopause and you don't know that you have ADHD, it can be very confusing, both for you and the psychiatrist or the psychologist who's trying to diagnose you. But if you have a look at the slide, things like irritability and anger and forgetfulness and the problems with concentration and the problems with fatigue, they look exactly alike. And it's only when you start to tease out the more physical perimenopause symptoms, such as night sweats or hot flushes. Not everybody has those, but many do. But also the subtle alteration in the actual menstrual cycle itself, and a gradual or rapid loss of interest in sex. That is how we start to differentiate the two. The other thing with ADHD in particular is it's the very rapidly shifting attention. So it's called distractibility, but another way of looking at it is you focus on something momentarily it's not important, it's not very interesting, it's dull, so you move on to something else. And that can happen with surprising rapidity. One of the strengths of ADHD is this ability to rapidly assess what's going on around you. If it's not interesting, or it's not threatening, or it's not, a baby about to fall into the fire, then you just move on. But if it's something that's important or interesting, whatever that means, you can hyper focus on it until there are some solutions. And that it's those sorts of features that help us differentiate perimenopause from ADHD. Perhaps the other things are things like organisational skills. Most people with ADHD aren't that good at keeping stuff organised. The table tends to look like a bomb's hit it, or it's pristine because they're perfectionists. And the perfectionism is very characteristic of ADHD and comes about very much from Kirstin's description of how throughout childhood the effort required to be the social glue, if you like, of being part of a social group. Being a perfectionist helps your self-esteem, tells other people that you're okay, and so you're more accepted. Perfectionism wouldn't be something that you would see in perimenopause. Probably the opposite, I think. So that's the dilemma that we're faced with. And as a psychiatrist, I ask huge numbers of questions. And it does help if there is a background history in childhood, or we can look at school reports or talk to mum. But the interesting thing is, somebody queried this in the questions, mum doesn't always know. Mum may not have recognised it. You may not have school reports. You may not remember. But usually careful questioning unearths enough evidence from childhood to suggest that, okay, you've arrived in adulthood with symptoms of ADHD, and maybe you're 44 and you've got some symptoms of perimenopause as well. That's me.
We'll pick up, I think, a little bit more on the assessment process, because I think that'll also help tease out some of those queries that people are having. But, the other kind of complicating factor at times is that ADHD can look like, but it can also coexist with other mental health, with mental health disorders and things. And this is by no means a complete list, but it's the ones that I think pop up often. It's certainly the ones that I have heard, had clients have this kind of dual diagnosis, or a diagnosis of one, and then it's like, hang on a minute, that it's not that. We now know it's ADHD. So Dave, can you speak a little bit to, I guess, this kind of dilemma that can present itself?
If I can get a bit technically scientific, we have to remember that pretty much all mental and physical illness, somewhere there is a genetic vulnerability. ADHD is one of the most genetically or hereditary type of conditions. And if those of you who think you may have it, if you look at mum or dad, uncles, aunts, grandparents, you may well find somebody who's very much like you. Because it's got that genetic underpinning, it will share genes with many other mental health conditions, in particular bipolar disorder, schizophrenia and autistic spectrum disorder. And so it's not uncommon that you've got the genetic vulnerabilities for one or two of those, or a lot of one and a bit of the other, and then something in your environment triggers it, and lo and behold, you show up with ADHD, and a bit of autistic spectrum is a very, very common one, as most people know. Depression and anxiety there is a predisposition in ADHD to those conditions. In my clinical experience, and particularly with women, the anxiety is very, very much a social type of anxiety. And when we tease it backwards from adolescence or adulthood, it comes back to that experience in childhood of, I suppose, what we could call ongoing micro trauma. So being told by your friends, oh, you're a bit odd, aren't you? Or, I don't get invited to birthday parties, or just feeling different, and seeing other people's expressions confirm that you're not quite the same. Those are micro traumas, and over many years they add together to give rise to quite trauma-based conditions like depression and anxiety. If unfortunately you've experienced much more overt trauma in childhood, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, that will simply multiply the effect. And there is emerging evidence that it will multiply the effects of your hormones on you as well. So the Her Centre just recently published some papers on trauma in early childhood can affect the hormone system. So it's a double whammy in many ways. PMDD is perhaps a reflection of being exquisitely sensitive to your hormone system. And so you don't just get a bit of PMS, premenstrual stress, you get overt symptoms of anxiety, depression, suicidal thinking. It's quite a dramatic presentation, and it reflects that exquisite sensitivity. But of course, it also will affect, as we'll see perhaps a couple of slides later, it will also affect your ADHD symptoms and their treatment. Over to you.
Oh, so do you want to move on then into issues of diagnosis then, like how you go about diagnosing ADHD?
The short, simple answer is make sure you have a lot of time, both you and your patient, and ask a lot of questions. So the usual routine is that somebody has a suspicion, they have a child with ADHD and they think, oh, I'm just like them. They have a friend who has ADHD and they say, hey, you're much like me. There are many reasons that we've already explored, but you need a GP referral to a psychiatrist for that. You can also be diagnosed by a psychologist. The difference between the two is that both of us will diagnose ADHD, except that the psychiatrist, the way I approach it is I don't diagnose ADHD. What I do is I do a comprehensive psychiatric assessment, and if it turns out that you've got ADHD, or something else and ADHD, then we can treat everything that you've got. Part of the problem that we face is that very often GPs will just write a quick one line, could you please see this person for ADHD, thinks they've got it because their child has it, and leaves out all of the information that I desperately need as a psychiatrist. I need to know about your physical health as well. I need to know about your gut health and your immune system and all of these other things, because all of those can contribute to either having ADHD or not having ADHD, or having ADHD and making it a hell of a lot worse. So having a long time is important, because I have to explore all of those areas. At the core of it, will be asking about, what were you like as a child at school? What were you like as a teenager? Tell me about anxiety. You mentioned you had anxiety, and so we go down that pathway of, why are you anxious? Why do you have social anxiety? And that often reveals the evidence that you probably had ADHD as a child, but masked it beautifully. Women are extraordinarily capable actors at masking their ADHD. But if you ask enough questions and you go in underneath, as it were, they can remember enough to go, okay, yep.
Sorry, David, can I just inject and let you know that there are a lot of the people in our audience at the moment are saying how impressed they are with you as a psychiatrist. They wish all the psychiatrists were as thorough as you.
Yeah, unfortunately, it does take a very long time, and that's why we're expensive. But ultimately, you have to do it. It's the only way to find out everything that's going on.
Absolutely.
And then dealing with it. If they're diagnosed with a psychologist, that's fabulous, because then I have a very, very thorough analysis of their cognitive function, of their ADHD symptoms. I can build on that. So it's not wasted, but I still have a lot of other stuff to ask about and to think about.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Kirstin, from the psychologist perspective, have you got some things to chip in with on that, on the diagnostic aspects?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is variation amongst psychologists. Like I think there is, people are learning that there's variation in psychiatrists in terms of how the process that they go through. For me, I do like to find out whether people would be seeking medication, like if they're prepared to be, like if they think they're ADHD, would they be prepared to be trying medication? Because I like to be really upfront and say, well, psychologists don't prescribe, so what steps do you want to take now? I often see people for an assessment who either won't be considering ADHD medication, or at least not at that point when I ask the question, or secondly, they really want to know and they can't simply wait, because as you'd appreciate, the wait lists for psychiatrists, I mean, most of them, their books are closed, and it's this magic window of opportunity to kind of get in, which if you miss it, then you're too bad, so sad, and for the next 6 months, sometimes 12. So those are the circumstances where I see people. I actually like to do a bit of a screening process first, because I would actually like to be able to say to them, look, this screening process has revealed that it might be useful for you to pursue a full ADHD assessment. At the same time, then if it was kind of indicating no, ADHD is not part of the picture, then I give them the choice. And that, to be honest, is a bit about my value system, and also finances for people. I don't want them to waste their money undergoing an entire assessment process with me, which is a really lengthy process, if there's a bit of a sense that perhaps this isn't relevant to them. But once we kind of move beyond that, we're definitely looking at other mental health issues. We're looking at their full social history. We're asking similar questions to what Dave has mentioned. We really, and the interesting thing is when anyone kind of says, I can't remember really much after beyond 12. And I mean, I laughed when my psychiatrist asked if I had school reports, like, you know, as if I'm going to have them. Some people do though, which is fascinating to me, but most don't. But when you spend time with people asking them about, you know, specifically the things that you're looking for, which is evidence of the kind of challenges that we have, more often than not, they can find them. They've just not necessarily attributed them to ADHD. And that's the new kind of lens that the whole process provides them with. So a lot of people tell me when they go through the assessment process, it's also very educative for them. It really helps them start to understand themselves. And for me, that's how I like to approach an assessment, whatever the outcome might be. So I think there's some similarities, and of course there's differences as well. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you for that. So I'd like to move on now if we can. We've got about 15 minutes left before, if we want to have a decent Q&A time in which to cover the medical treatments, the neuroaffirming support area, and also Sherri's research. So do you want to lead us off for that, please, Kirstin, or should we just launch in with David and the medical stuff?
I'm going to quickly show this slide because I think it makes sense to a lot of the people that are joining us. And that slide is that there's this research. Thank you, Dave, for sharing it. I'm not sure if it's the same research done by the Attitude Group, but they certainly found that women were reporting that the symptoms of ADHD were most challenging during their menopausal kind of transition. And I think that's a really useful piece of information for us to know that this is a difficult time in our life, and it's when things can certainly become far more apparent than ever before. So I just wanted to mention that, but let's move to Dave. So he is the person to be talking about the medical treatment of ADHD.
Okay, I should preempt it by saying there is non-medical treatment. ADHD coaching can be incredibly useful, both in conjunction with medical treatment and just instead of medical treatment. It's a bit like antidepressants and psychological intervention in mood disorders. Two together are better than either on their own. So this is sort of a bit of a hierarchy, if you like, of the medical treatments. There are some antidepressants, Prozac, desvenlafaxine, Effexor, Pristiq, can be quite effective in ADHD for some people because they help the frontal lobe in particular start controlling the rest of the brain. There is one antidepressant called Strattera, which is very, very widely used in children with ADHD. It's not a particularly good antidepressant, but it's pretty good at ADHD. The downside to most antidepressants, or all of them really, is you can't stop and start them at will. And they can have varying side effects depending on the person. You know, they might put on weight, they might lose weight, their libido might go down, they might get headaches. There's all sorts of side effects with any antidepressant, both in ADHD and outside of ADHD. But atomoxetine, Strattera, is very effective. There is another group called the alpha-2 agonists, and don't worry too much about that complicated name, but there's a short-acting version called clonidine, which is often given to children with ADHD to help them sleep. There's a long-acting form called guanfacine, or its trade name is Inchinib, widely used overseas in adults and children, widely used here in children, perhaps not as common in adults. but both of them effective. Guanfacine in particular, Inchinib is particularly good at managing ADHD. The other effect that they have is they drop your blood pressure pretty much dramatically. So you have to be careful you don't sort of get wobbly when you stand up. But other than that, they're relatively benign and safe medication. The big advantage of both of those is your GP can prescribe them without any particular authority to prescribe. The gold standard are the stimulant medications, and the ones that most people are aware of are dexamphetamine or methylphenidate or Ritalin, and these are incredibly effective, and they are slightly different. Dexamphetamine and its long-acting form, Vyvanse, is particularly good, perhaps at improving cognitive function. Ritalin, methylphenidate, and its long-acting forms, Concerta and Ritalin LA, perhaps is a little bit better at managing emotional ups and downs, and perhaps impulsivity if you tend to be a bit impulsive, but both of them are very, very effective overall. And there are a couple of others, modafinil and armodafinil and a few others, but they're not used very widely with ADHD. They're the two main ones, and sometimes they're used together. Sometimes they're used in conjunction with the alpha-2 agonists because they're benefits to both. Perhaps the most important thing about any of these medications, all of them, is that they should be started in a very low dose and gradually increase with maybe keeping a diary so that you monitor the effect. And at some point, the effect will be just right. If you go any further, no improvement. If you go even further, you'll get the jitters or something uncomfortable. So we can find what is a just right dose, and then you have the option of whether you have quick acting ones or the long acting ones or mixture of both. And usually it requires anywhere from 2 weeks to a month or even 6 weeks to do this titration. Gradually increase. Just depends how brave you are at increasing the dose. The effect is often amazing, and some people, the best description I heard when somebody started on Ritalin was, "Oh, I feel like a zombie." A little while later, they came back and said, "Oh, maybe I just feel normal." So sometimes we have to tweak the dose a few months down the track, but eventually we find the best dose for you, and then you can either stay with your psychiatrist to keep on prescribing and monitoring, or we can transfer care to your GP and they can continue on, and you only go back to the psychiatrist when you're required to by regulations.
Thank
Kelly.
you very much for that overview, David. Much appreciated. And there are a few questions on the medication aspects, which we might get to in the question time. But for now, I'll hand over to Kirstin to do us a quick run through of her neuroaffirming support, and then we'll hear a bit about Sherri's research to finish up.
Okay. Thank you, Kelly. And Dave, I could listen to you talk about this stuff forever. I really wanted to bring in the notion of, even that's not a favourite word of mine, neuroaffirming, because I think so many ADHDers walk through life feeling broken, feeling like something's wrong with them. They've had all sorts of messaging, microaggressions, micro traumas, as Dave spoke about previously. And, you know, we carry a lot of negative messaging about ourselves, and we have internalized it typically. And, you know, one of the things I think we need to consider when we're looking at a neuroaffirming approach, it's really just understanding that our brains work differently. It's not that they're worse, it's not that they're deficient or anything like that. It's just that there's a difference. And to be honest, I think over time what we're going to find is that, you know, all our brains are very, very different, and maybe it won't even be a relevant thing to be diagnosed with ADHD, because the perspective at a social level will be, wow, people's brains are different. How can we kind of accommodate people's needs and talents and things? And so for me, a neuroaffirming approach is really important, that perspective that it's a difference, not a deficit. And taking that into our lives is actually quite challenging. And I certainly found it challenging myself, because my, you know, default was to beat myself up for, you know, certain challenges that I have, and to feel as though, why can everyone seem to do it easily or get it right or whatever. And also at times, you know, having it reveal just how much effort I had to put into kind of, as I said before, proper adulting, and thinking again that there was something kind of inherently wrong. Although people would say to me, I made it look easy, but it was very, very effortful. And so for me, because I work at that kind of coalface with women who are who either have known that their ADHD is for a really long time, or they're actually late diagnosed, it is a very new way of looking at themselves. And often that, particularly the late diagnosis, brings a heck of a lot of relief of, oh, I've got an explanation. But at the same time, it can bring a lot of grief and anger about missed opportunities and the challenges that they've had along the way without the support. And so the process in itself can be quite confronting, but it can help provide and encourage a self-compassionate lens and a neuroaffirming lens. Let's look for our strengths and not just focus on our challenges. Let's look at the compensatory strategies that we use and masking that we've engaged in, and let's see if we can shift that into being more of ourselves when it is helpful for us. And if it's not, let's make sure, or at least ask ourselves the question, who am I masking for? Because masking brings about a lot of shame. Unmasking can too, though. And so, you know, it all serves a purpose. There's no good or bad. Compensatory strategies can be both a blessing and a curse. Masking can be a blessing and a curse, but ultimately would be trying to live fully as ourselves as much as possible, with accommodations, with things that we can implement into our lives that make the hard parts a bit easier and can really kind of leverage off the talents and the strengths that we have. And one of those things is really understanding how the ADHD brain works, and that is that we have an interest-based nervous system, an interest-based brain, and that provides enormous talents and strengths. But at the same time, we don't have an importance-based brain. So things that are important don't necessarily light us up or motivate us to do them. And that's where the challenges come in. So I could talk a heck of a lot more about it, but I think that is the journey of an ADHDer in terms of really understanding how their brain works. And as I said, finding the strengths, recognizing them, having compassion and accommodations for some of the challenges that we experience just by living in what is largely a neurotypical world. Over to Sherri.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, so fabulous to actually be having these conversations. And because of these conversations and just the lack of understanding and knowledge out in the general area of science and women's health, I've got this really fabulous opportunity to do graduate research at Murdoch University in Perth here. And I really wanted to have a look at the intersection of ADHD and menopause and really explore the lived experience of women, a misdiagnosis, and also identity reconstruction. So what is happening in that area, and what happens when you get a late diagnosis with your identity, when you come through menopause. There's lots of different changes So just some of the questions that I'm really sort of wanting to have a look at were, how did women come to seek a late diagnosis during that menopause transition? Was that because you know, there was increased demands in life? Was it because of this burnout? You couldn't mask any longer? Was it mental health decline? There's so many different sort of reasons, and really wanting to explore that. Wanting to explore if ADHD symptoms are intensified if you actually already have a diagnosis when you hit that menopausal transition area, and what was the impact for you as well, the impact on your life, your family, your work. What is the impact of a late diagnosis or a misdiagnosis later in life? And what are the barriers to an early diagnosis? You know, we've had lots of questions just asking that exact question. And that leads to some regret, thinking about, gosh, why didn't I do this earlier? Perhaps, you know, my life could have looked quite different. You know, women being quite unheard and not validated with their experience, no support. And what does that do to your identity? And as we move into that area, our agreeableness definitely, well, mine certainly has gone south, that's for sure. Some other questions, you know, having a look at, are women with ADHD more likely to develop those comorbid conditions that David was talking about earlier during this menopause transition? Depression, anxiety, bipolar, and, you know, PMDD, those types of things. Have you been diagnosed with ADHD later in life, but there's no signs of it in childhood? And, you know, what happens then? Is there any such thing as developing ADHD later in life? Or is that, you know, that crossover with that menopause? Or how does trauma impact? Perhaps, you know, you've experienced some significant traumas later in life that may have done something to have that intersection. So that would be really wonderful to know as well. And also really, really importantly, what would have helped you to feel more supported and perhaps arrive at an earlier diagnosis? What recommendations would you like to see, and how can we have the medical community and the community at large support women with a diagnosis? Okay, lots of questions.
That is marvellous. Thank you so much, Sherri. And it really aligns with a lot of the comments and questions coming through. So somebody particularly asked, if I can find it again, does your research include the role of ADHD and menopause plays in, oh goodness, that keeps jumping around as more people write in, plays in marriage breakdown, job loss, and therefore the high occurrence of financial instability and housing insecurity in women over 55. Do you think there's a connection there?
Oh, look, I mean, absolutely. And, you know, I think this is such a huge area and such a little amount of research that I've just actually, I'm in the process of applying for this to end up being more of a PhD than sort of, you know, anything smaller than that. So cross fingers, and those kind of questions, to ask those kind of questions, because yes, as Dave might want to talk to that as well, but that's very common.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Dave, I muted you, so you're going to have to unmute yourself. But yeah, too much paper rustling there. I'm sorry. Okay, what we might do then, unless any of our speakers have any particular things that they wanted to say to finish up on, we might launch into some Q&A stuff.
I just thought I'd mention, backing up what Sherri was talking about, that there have been a couple of 3 major surveys, 2 in the United Kingdom and 1 here, on women in the midlife who are going through separation or divorce. And there is quite a lot of evidence from those people that the effects of perimenopause, they believe contributed significantly to the breakdown of the relationship. As a clinical observation, and there's not been as much evidence, research on this, somebody with ADHD in a relationship with somebody without ADHD can often be quite tumultuous, and they don't necessarily last as well as they might. Two people with ADHD seems to be remarkably stable, and it's a reflection perhaps of they actually understand each other, whereas somebody with ADHD and somebody without, the person without can sometimes wonder what on earth the other person is on about.
Absolutely. Now, just to clarify too, Sherri, people can actually access your research by using the QR codes on the screen. Is that correct?
Yeah, so look, unfortunately, I'm not sort of starting it until mid next year, but but I'll be looking for participants, you know, at the end of next year, starting to sort of get those things rolling. But Kirstin has actually kindly got some QR codes together. They're on her website. So if anybody is interested in perhaps sending them off to other people or being a participant yourself, that would be amazing. So you could just leave your details, and I will get to you, but it won't be until probably next year, end of next year.
We'll put some of those details in the email that we send the recording link out with as well. I'll get that from you that we can send everyone. Okay, so why don't I start feeding you guys some questions now, because we've got lots and lots and lots in the chat box. But firstly, a few things that came through before the start of the webinar. In particular, and I haven't got the names of the people who asked, unfortunately, but one question was that when menopause is over, will my ADHD symptoms ease up? That might be a David and Kirstin question there.
Kirstin, have you got any thoughts?
That as well, I mean, what I noticed from working with women, and I tend to work with them over quite a period of time, in terms of perimenopause and through to postmenopausal kind of life, is that there is kind of a bit of a relief that comes with it. And I think that comes down to, I've got a really lovely friend who's a neuroscientist, Dr. Jen Hacker-Pearson, and she's all over the kind of neuroscience of this particular stage of life. And it's both a stage of vulnerability and opportunity. And, you know, the hormonal periods, puberty, pregnancy, postpartum, and perimenopause are kind of all times when our brain is most neuroplastic, which is what provides both that vulnerability and opportunity. But I think, you know, anecdotally, I certainly know that my clients report as they move further and further into those postmenopausal years that there's a settling to some degree of their ADHD symptoms. And it's a bit like, what is it? You know, is it that your MHT is working? Is it your stimulant medication's working? Is it that your brain's finally caught up? And because there's been that stability in your hormones, that is probably a conversation for Dave to answer. But I think
and it's in line. It's aligned with this diagram, isn't it, there too, because you've got more hormonal stability for your brain as well once the reproductive hormones are calming down. I have another, just more of a comment that you might like to reflect on, David, here is Samantha said that the biggest issue for her was that the medication that had worked so well previously to manage her ADHD stopped working when she got into perimenopause and menopause, but that once she'd been on HRT for a few weeks, her other ADHD medication started working well again. Would that be aligned with your experience?
It's it's very much like somebody asked a question about cyclical dosing. We know that, for example, the stimulants are affected very much by estrogen levels. So if your estrogen level has dropped, as far as the research suggests, and it's not clear, the medications are less effective. And so if you return to your normal levels of estrogen, then the medication will work much better, or will go back to working as it was before. But it's not well understood yet. It's still an area that we need a lot more research on.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to go right to the top of the question chat box now, back to earlier. What do you think of the new concept of adult ADHD, where there's insufficient evidence for a strictly traditional diagnosis? Is that legitimate? I mean, insufficient evidence of existence before the age of 12. That came from Sally. I'm not quite sure what the crux of that question is, but you might understand it better than I do.
It's a difficult one. The ADHD has existed, or knowledge about ADHD has existed for hundreds of years. There is nothing new about it whatsoever. The problem partly has been that it was only noticed in good old hyperactive young boys running amok, and the quiet daydreamy girl in the corner was overlooked. We know that the hyperactive and to some extent the impulsiveness wanes during puberty. So by the time people get to sort of 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, very often the hyperactivity has dropped quite dramatically. But that doesn't mean to say the ADHD has gone away. It just means that some aspects of it have diminished, and the inattentiveness and some of the impulsiveness still remains. What we also know is that the brain undergoes an incredible rewiring in puberty. So it starts at the back and it gradually rewires over forward like this, and somewhere around about the age of 23, 24, 25, earlier in girls and boys, it reaches the front part here, and that completes the brain maturation. About, I don't know, maybe a third of people with ADHD in childhood, that does not putting it in simple terms, that doesn't fix the wiring that is the underlying cause of ADHD. So those people go on to have ADHD in adulthood, and it can, in some cases, it can look just like it did in childhood. A young jackaroo, you know.
There is another question on that, actually, David. So can you actually make a diagnosis of ADHD if you're unaware whether symptoms were present before the age of 12?
Technically, no, you can't. But providing you've asked enough questions to rule out the things that look remarkably like ADHD, and what you're left with still looks like it, and as Kirstin and I have said, you delve deeply enough, carefully enough, skillfully enough, you can get a sense of childhood, then it's worth trialing medication. And if it doesn't work, then they don't have ADHD. But usually it does. And so the fact that they responded to medication, you're treating the symptoms. You have improved their life. Whether you've got the label of ADHD or not, perhaps is not that important. The problem is that everybody bows down to DSM-5. DSM is the research criteria document. It's not a clinical document. It doesn't even include emotional dysregulation as part of the assessment and diagnosis of ADHD, but it's very, very, very frequently common in ADHD. So to some extent, we make clinical diagnoses, and sometimes we're wrong, then we have to change. But Sometimes we do it on, I suppose, on evidence-based intuition, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's another one which I will direct to you, David. So Nina has asked a question which relates to whether there's any research around why the ADHD meds don't work as well in perimenopause, being difficult to predict around the cycles and everything. So in line with that, we often treat things like PMS and PMDD by suppressing ovulations in our perimenopausal population, because that gives then you don't get all of that hormonal chaos that's affecting the brain chemistry, and so you've got a calmer baseline from which then to look at whether you need any hormonal treatments or ADHD medications or whatever. So I guess that suggests to me that the reason why the ADHD meds aren't working so well is because of the hormonal instability. Yeah. Would that be right?
Yeah. The evidence is not super duper, but it is suggestive. That's exactly. It does raise an interesting issue that I faced last week of a lady diagnosed ADHD, perimenopausal. What do you treat first?
It's a very good question. It's a bit like the question of perimenopausal depression, isn't it? And, some doctors throwing antidepressants at it and other doctors sort of thinking that hormones should be first line. It's always a bit of a hotly debated topic, isn't it, in clinical circles? Okay, on to one I think for more for Sherri and for Kirstin. How do you get past the not believing and feeling like it can't be real? Danny has asked. Yeah, I'm guessing that means not believing yourself what your diagnosis is.
Oh, look, I mean, I'll just quickly speak for myself. I really found that a challenge to actually, think about how many things were so obvious now, particularly after having a diagnosis and doing so well on stimulant medication. But I just, I guess you just get into that sort of rhetoric that it's your experience and you're just living it, and maybe you're just not coping as well as you should be, and you need to eat better, or you need to exercise more, what's wrong with me? Maybe I'm being too lazy. So look, I think perhaps I would definitely recommend going and talking to a psychologist, talking to some people or some friends that have some experience with ADHD, doing some research, really talking to your GP. And if you're not getting any sort of help with your GP, don't be afraid to change. Go and see somebody else. Go and see somebody in the women's sort of health area that specializes in menopause and those kinds of things. And people like Dave, who are just so holistic and we need to cookie cutter you out to Australia.
Don't we? Yeah. And I suppose, Kirstin, there'd be a big role for psychologists in helping women make the adjustment to, once they've reached this or got this diagnosis, and how to integrate that into their life.
Absolutely. I mean, like Sherri, I didn't believe my psychiatrist for a year, I reckon. And then I had this battle. I was like, how arrogant of you to think that, she doesn't know what she's talking about. And then I'd be like, well, but how did I get through university and, all the things and all the rest? That was absolutely a battle. I mean, it did help that my 3 sons are diagnosed ADHD, and that's how it started. And one has a different dad, so I'm kind of the common thread. So that was helpful for sure. But the absolute clincher for me was working with a psychologist who actually could help me understand how it had showed up for me in a far more individualized, nuanced way. Because again, and even if I pulled back and didn't have that stereotypical picture that I mentioned earlier in the webinar, I still was quite naive about how it played. I just thought this is how I was, like life experience led me to be a certain way, and birth order and all the things that psychologists normally go to. And yeah, she really helped me unpack what ADHD looks like, feels like within me, and how it's expressed by me. And that was critical for me to come to terms with the diagnosis, for sure.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much for that. Another one for you. Oh, yes, David.
I was just looking at some of the questions, and somebody said how shocked they were at the cost of menopausal hormone therapy. There is a federal, I think it's a Senate inquiry underway into menopause. And I think if people are up in arms about it, they need to find that and log into it and say, it needs to be on the PBS. The costs, there has been some costing of menopause, and it's a mind-blowing cost to the economy, you know.
You're speaking my language, David. That was one of my key points when I appeared at the Senate hearing into perimenopause and menopause. And in fact, on the WellFemme website, on our blog section, now that the Senate inquiry has handed down its recommendations, we need to try and convince government to accept and put money behind the recommendations. And so we've done a pro forma on there where everybody can, in 5 minutes flat, shoot off an email with all of those, like saying, we want reasonably priced MHT, we want our government to commit to the recommendations in the Senate inquiry, and you can shoot that off to your local politicians. So I'll put the link to that blog post in our email that we send you around with the recording links as well. Awesome. David, another one here. Can ADHD medication in itself be diagnostic? So if someone's not sure about their diagnosis, people are asking, I guess this is like, oh, I had my son's medication and I felt better, so I must have So what do you say about that?
Yeah, all right. One of the series of questions I ask is about, do you smoke cigarettes? Yeah, what do they do for you? Do you drink alcohol? What does it do for you? Have you had cannabis? What does it do for you? And for many people with ADHD, cannabis slows their mind, clears their mind. That's not the same as making them stoned. It acts on their mind. And then the next question is, have you ever had speed or, slimming pills? And if they have, oh, what did you notice? And the classic story is of somebody who said, oh, yeah, I had some speed at a party and I just fell asleep on the lounge. That's not normal. The other normal is a lady who I look after for quite a long time, who takes 40 milligrams of Ritalin LA at bedtime to go to sleep. That is not a normal response. So no, technically it can't be diagnostic, but it's just one more of those things that adds to a picture that enables you to say, I think you've got ADHD.
And do women going through menopause and perimenopause often need adjustments to their medications?
Cyclical dosing. So not everybody, but quite a few will need to up their medication dose in the week before the period when the estrogen has nosedived. Women in pregnancy, when the estrogen level has gone up through the roof, which is why women glow in pregnancy because they're so full of estrogen, they may need to drop their dose or not even take any at all. And then when they hit menopause, perimenopause, because the level does this, then they may well find that it isn't enough. They need to up it. Yeah, so
Yeah.
you have to play it by ear, basically.
Someone asked whether I could please clarify about MHT on the PBS. There are MHT products on the PBS. Unfortunately, not all the safest evidence-based products are on the PBS, which is something that we're trying to address through the Pharmaceutical Advisory Committee right now. In fact, micronized progesterone, for example, has been shown to be one of the safer progestogens that is less likely to cause an increase in breast cancer risk, and it's not on the PBS. But some of the older synthetic progestins that have been around forever and are nice and cheap, they're on the PBS. Unfortunately, they have been shown to slightly increase breast cancer risk after 5 years of use. So this is where, the PBS and the listings of medications is really lagging behind the current evidence, and that's where we need to get really, annoying our politicians about that and demanding that the safest, most evidence-based products do go on the PBS.
Yeah.
Now, for you, Kirstin and Sherri, are you either of you or any of you aware of good peer support groups on Facebook or other online mediums where people can go and continue conversations like this?
It's funny. My first response is, are there any Facebook groups that are kind of safe? Because I feel both of these experiences, whether it's menopause or whether it's ADHD, can be quite polarizing. And I've withdrawn myself from a few groups just because they were, too polarizing for me. So I know that's not a helpful answer by any means. But, one thing I would say is a colleague of Sherri's and I, as in clinical psychologist, clinical neuropsychologist, does have a great resource. And that is a podcast called The Neurodivergent Woman Australia. They're both Australian psychologists. That's fantastic. And I believe they also have, is it a Patreon or a Substack? Like, they do have some kind of offshoot community that people can be a part of as well. But yeah, I haven't really come across that. It's one of those areas that I think is lacking. I do think there's a lot of menopause kind of support groups and Facebook groups, but they're the ones I've actually found the most challenging to be in.
There's another podcast, The Imperfects. I was just talking to Alex, clinic director, which is fabulous. Apparently, some really good information on that. And also, they've just started running. I mean, it is for students at Murdoch. If you are a student in Perth, an ADHD group there, which has been absolutely fantastic. They run them at Curtin University as well. So maybe just have a little look around.
Absolutely.
Actually, the universities can be a really good place to have a look, because the psych departments at the universities often run an internal clinic for the master students to first, kind of work with clients and things. And they often have initiatives. It's also either a free or a very, very, very low cost service. So look at your local universities and look for the psych clinics for the master students that do their practice there.
And they may actually, you never know, they may run a group that that is going to be low cost.
A support group, And of course, if anyone's in need of psychological services, menopause and perimenopause informed psychologists and other health practitioners are available on the directory and the All About Her platform. So we'll put a link to that when we send around our email. So why don't we, we're just about over time now. So I'd like to ask each of our speakers what their key take-home messages they'd like to send out to all of our audience tonight. David, let's start with you.
Good. If you look at somebody in your family and they look a bit like you, and you wonder what on earth is going on with them, go and see somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. Kirstin?
Mine would definitely be that the menopause is tricky for many. ADHD is tricky for many. Combine the two, it's really tricky. So doses of compassion and educating yourself is critical. Like that, I think makes a huge difference. Yeah, absolutely.
Sherri?
Yeah, I think the same as Kirstin. Just educate yourself. Don't give up. If you're getting closed doors around the place, just go somewhere else and try to find answers for yourself.
Absolutely. And for me, it would be the holistic nature of all of this. You know, we can't actually work out that this part of us is because of ADHD, and this part of us is because of the perimenopause, and this part of it's because of our crappy marriage, and this part of it's because of my stressful job. It's all there, whether we like it or not, and we're managing it as a red hot mess all together. So I think we just focus on, you know, what the priority symptoms are at the time and methodically work through those. You know, look after yourself and be healthy, and you know, find supportive people and health professionals to surround yourself with, like these ones right here. And David has a brand new fan club base right here. So I'll call it there. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Thank you to our amazing panelists here, and for the wonderful discussion this evening and all the great information. Thank you once more. All of you have a lovely, lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks very much.